Welcome back to HSR, and today I want to talk about older characters, standard or otherwise. I feel like as of right now, all you really hear about is characters such as Acheron, Fei Zhao, and even our relative DOT meta, being Kafka and Black Swan. Supporting units such as Sparkle or Robin really are spoken about consistently because they're supporting characters. They're pretty much always relevant and they fulfill a specific niche. But outside of that, SW for example, Jing Yuan, Jing Liu, even the likes of IL and Sealy aren't really spoken about. And let's all be honest here, Blade is a character who was extremely well revered upon release, but doesn't get brought up much, if at all. Realistically, the only time he's really beneficial and really sees a place in the meta or in those discussions is when you're thinking about doing SU or Divergent Universe and you are going to run primarily an abundance-oriented path because he benefits from abundance blessings. And as of right now, I don't think necessarily that's a bad thing. Don't get me wrong, Acheron, Firefly, Fei Zhao, these are incredibly strong units. But the older units that people use, the follow-up units such as Jing Yuan, the DOT characters without Kafka, Blade, IL, Sealy, and even Jing Liu are still exceptional units, but because they're older, because they don't have the damage multipliers of somebody like Acheron or Fei Zhao, or the specific niche in terms of the damage being brought out, i.e. Firefly depending on Break and Super Break, they aren't really spoken about. IL is a character who is subsequently being replaced or competing with Jing Liu, who's competing with Sealy, who's competing with Jing Yuan, who's competing with Acheron. None of these characters offer anything exceptional or unique. Firefly being a character who's dependent on breaking means that she operates as a break-focused damage dealer. That's why people like her. But everybody else is just competing for the same slot. And as a result, if Acheron deals higher damage with lower requirement or more flexibility than somebody like Jing Yuan or Jing Liu or Sealy and IL, they're just going to talk about Acheron. But are these characters even bad? Now, as an individual who has Acheron's LC with her E2, with a very heavily invested Acheron team, my opinion is a little bit biased and shifted towards her strictly because I'm having her with realistically her best potential, i.e. it's her LC and her E2, so I'm very flexible with the teammates I can run with her. And my Jing Yuan, he has his light cone sometimes, but I gave it to Herder. I don't know why, I don't even use Herder like that. But he doesn't have Eidolons. My IL has his Eidolons. Steely has E2. Yanqing is using her LC because I like Yanqing more. Blade has his LC. Jing Liu has her LC and it's E6. And so yeah, my perspective on these characters is going to be entirely different for somebody who maybe doesn't have either of these characters, or somebody who's running the exact same Acheron team, but maybe without E2, or without Silverwolf. And so the damage loss as a result of running W in comparison to Xiaoqi or someone else is much more significant. But I do feel like it's important to mention, a lot of these characters are still very good. If you're looking at somebody like IL, for example, his biggest issue is skill point economy. And yes, that's solved by Sparkle. One of the reasons why a lot of individuals don't choose to use IL though, is because realistically speaking, if you're going to use Sparkle, you'd rather use her with somebody who just deals higher damage at a base valuation. Acheron uses 1 skill point, that's it. IL uses 3. IL maybe can deal higher damage and maybe does have a better E2 depending on the circumstance, but he needs Sparkle to really hit that requirement, or he needs somebody who's fast enough and is more skill point positive to the extent where he can use 3 each time. Jing Liu is exceptionally easy to build because she gives herself so much crit. But the downside of this is twofold. First off, she kills your team. She drains their HP. That can already be mitigated by just having a healer. Realistically speaking, it's not that hard to do. But her second issue is, unlike Acheron, unlike every other DPS as of right now, Jing Liu doesn't have a solid support geared towards her. If you are attempting to utilize Jing Liu in any capacity, you want to ideally get her LC. But Death Shred and Death Ignore gets a lot more valuable the more of it you have. And so your Jing Liu could benefit either A, from somebody like Sparkle with E2, B, somebody like Pella to reduce the enemy's defense, or C, a Ron Mei. And if you're utilizing Ron Mei, well, if you just slotted her with Firefly, you'd have a better team. And so Jing Liu's issue isn't necessarily that she's a bad unit. I think by far she's an amazing unit and is really, really good. But she doesn't have the base damage multipliers of an ultimate like Acheron, like Fei Zhao, or even Firefly to that extent. To that same degree, I do think her Eidolons are all good, don't get me wrong. I think E1 is great, I think E2 is great, but I do think that she gets more value across the board from it, rather than somebody like Acheron, who has so much value hidden in that E2 that it's kind of necessary if you want to get the maximum flexibility out of her. And whilst E4 sounds good, it's just okay. I also think that in terms of scaling, because Liu is a character who kills her team. Even if you are running a team in the exact same position to where you're sliding in Jingliu like you would in an Acheron team, Acheron benefits more from it because she's not taking her team's HP, so Fu Xuan's buffing capabilities shine a lot more. Jingliu giving herself so many stats, that attack, that crit rate, that crit damage, all of those stats mean that Jingliu is an incredibly difficult character to buff because the only thing you can use is either A, Def Shred or Def Ignore, or B, damage percent. And the only characters who can effectively provide that are either A HoYoverse at E6, which not many, if any of you are going to have, B, a Bronya, or C, a Tingyun. IL is, in theory at least, in a similar position. This is strictly because IL is a character who wants to use skill points. IL is a character who gives himself a bunch of crit damage. IL is a character who gives himself damage percentage. So he can benefit from attack, and if you have that E2, you ideally want to ult spam with him, so Tingyun and Hua are great partners. But he also needs somebody who can actively buff him. And you also want it to be skill point positive, where your only real option for that, unless you have Sparkle, is Yukong. But Yukong is incredibly dependent on either that E2 or that E6, because it allows her to just instantly ult and essentially buff him for that turn's duration. And if you're going to invest in Yukong, you might as well invest into a character who's more flexible. And once again, the biggest issue you run into with these older DPSs is flexibility. I think that as of right now, all of these characters is exceptional. All these characters are great. I think the biggest issue you're running into with certain units, such as Sealy, Yanqing, is the single target nature. I think Jing Yuan's biggest issue is the fact that outside of him being reliant on Lightning Lord, it's that Lightning Lord doesn't necessarily stay consistent within the turn order. If you are in combat and the wave is cleared and a new wave of enemies is brought forth, Lightning Lord will, in some occasions, just decide to be pushed back to his turn order initially from where he was previously. This means that, let's say hypothetically, you killed the entire wave of enemies and Lightning Lord was the next to act, meaning that when these enemies arrive, he should be the first to act. No, instead, the enemies get their turn because the turn order is reset, and as a result, Lightning Lord doesn't proc, which sucks. It's significantly worse than the likes of IL. It's worse than Yanqing's follow-up. It's worse than anyone else's follow-up because it's not consistent as a result. Also, Erudition as a class just kind of sucks. You need Robin right now for the follow-ups, and in that position, you just go with someone like Clara or Yunli because these are very plug-and-play units. I think Blade is in a similar position. Not because of the exact same issues as everybody else, but strictly because he's HP scaling. We have no HP scaling units as of right now outside of him that is not a healer. And as a direct result of that, the only ways to buff him are damage percentage. He can benefit from attack, sure, not that much, not nearly enough to make it worthwhile. He gets crits. And as a result, you don't have much you can do for this man. He's dependent on being hit. But if you're looking at a character who wants to be hit, these two units are much better because they don't have a specific requirement of being to be hit 5 times to proc. And even if you're looking at something like his, what if it's Eidolons, they're bad. They're bad from a value perspective strictly because, now instead of being hit 5 times, he has to be hit 4 times. Wonderful. Max HP increase is nice, but it's the only HP buff you're getting. Crit rate is nice until you realize that he has enough crit rate. And so you're running into an issue where he's so overcapped and overloaded with the stats he's getting, he needs more damage and more ways to deal damage and not more stats. It's far easier to get someone to buff crit. You can give you crit damage. You can get Sparkle's LC, give yourself crit. You can get Fu Xuan, give yourself crit. You can get this Blade is by default supposed to run to give yourself crits. I don't need crits. I need damage. And Blade's issue is outside of that. If you're going to look at his kit and you're going to look at everything he has right now, he gets damage percentage. Sure, amazing, wonderful. What else? Nothing. Because his kit doesn't have Def Shred or Def Ignore within it already. So he's not benefiting in the same capacity as a Jingliu. He's not benefiting in the same capacity as any other character. And it sucks, because if we're comparing him to somebody like Yunli, someone who's supposed to also be counter-based and wants to be hit, Yunli has damage. She has Def Ignore. She has effect resistance to keep her going, and then she has all-type resistance, penetration, and crit rate. Even Clara has counter, which doubles her damage. She has attack. She has damage mitigation, and then she increases the rate under which she is countering. These aren't bad characters. These aren't the most meta characters. These are just characters that are good by default. Blade doesn't have any ways to buff his damage significantly. If you're going to run him with Bronya, Bronya is great because Bronya gives damage percentage and crit damage, but she also, by and large, gives attack percentage as well. This attack isn't as useful for Blade. And so he's running this based off the crit damage and the raw damage percentage. That's great, but every other character in the game can occupy that. Yanqing, I love this character. He's adorable. I would absolutely, and I might be considering getting Fei Zhao's LC just for him. What is his issue? is the exact same issue that Sealy has. Single targets. Within this capacity, Yanqing does not operate effective in the current meta because the current meta wants AoE. And so despite him being a good character, especially if you're early in mid game because of the amount of stats he gives you, just like Leo in that capacity, he doesn't have anyone to significantly buff him because he can't be buffed in AoE. There's no one to spread damage around. He doesn't want to be hit and want to take damage. Fushuan doesn't work, so you have Japard. If you don't want to go Japard, you need Adventuring. That's fine. He does a follow-up attack. He gives himself a bunch of buffs. His Eidolons aren't that bad. Additional damage. Energy regen, so he ult spams more often. Ice resistance penetration, not that much though. And then more crit damage based on his ult, meaning that the ult buff you get is already extended to the entirety of that turn and to the next turn. This is nice. But single target characters will always be bad. In the same position as Liu, there isn't someone to buff him. You can go Robin for his follow-up attack, but his follow-up attack doesn't really have that big of a capacity to hit. It has a 60% chance that is fixed to do a follow-up. So yes, Valorous has been a buff to him, don't get me wrong, I recommend you run it if you like him, but it's not significant enough. These are older characters. Acheron and Firefly and Fei Zhao are fit for the current meta, but Acheron and Firefly don't do enough. Acheron is a character who could be replaced by IL, who could be replaced by any AoE units. Firefly is break dependent. Fei Zhao is follow-up damage, but she's single target. She avoids the issues of Yanqing and of Sealy by having consistency and consistent attacks and not needing some specific requirements. Sealy needs the enemy to die, Yanqing needs to not be hit. These aren't bad characters, and if you like them, you can use them. I honestly say if you like a character enough, invest into them. You're gonna get way more value out of them long term. There's no point in pulling for the hottest DPS character if you don't like that character. I like Acheron, I pull Acheron. I like Raiden, I pull Raiden. Jing Liu, I like. Jing Liu still performs great. Yun Li performs great. Clara performs great. All of these characters perform well enough if you invest into them. The only thing you're comparing is damage numbers. Acheron hits hard, but look at the requirement you need. 2 Annihility characters or 1 Annihility character and E2. Acheron isn't as plug and play. Firefly needs break. This means you need Firefly. You ideally want Ron Mei. You want to invest quite heavily in your Harmony MC. You want Gallagher or Ling Sha to really get that team going. And then if the enemy doesn't have a break bar, she's dead and in the water. 9 times out of 10, if you want someone to perform well and you want a unit to main long term, pull for a support. Pull for any of these 2 supports. Pull for Silverwolf, she's exceptional. Pull for any supportive character and you are going to be golden. A DPS is 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 a DPS. They can all be replaced by someone else, but your supports are your core. That's it. Invest in who you like. I adore Yanqing. I simp for Yanqing. He's one of my favorite characters. It has been since day one. I am extremely happy to be in E3 Yanqing Harrow, just as I am with Clara, and just as I will eventually be with Yun Li. I adore these characters. So just build them, build who you want, have fun. The strong characters will be strong, sure, but eventually they will be pushed aside for the next strongest character. That's the way this works. That's the way HoYoverse gacha has always works. Either way, I'll see you next time.